What's up everybody? I apologise for the delay with this video, but you would not believe it. This is the third time that I've had to record this Red Bull RB16 video. All manner of technical dramas going on behind the scenes here, all computer based, but anyway, I don't want to bore you with all of those. We're over them, I hope now, and this is it. Finally get to look at the car. Now look, this is obviously a Red Bull. It's very recognisable as such here on track at Silverstone at the hands of Max Verstappen. The livery is very, very similar. Lots of the details are very, very similar. I mean, immediately just looking at it, you can see it's still got this enormous rake angle on the car that has become so familiar to that Red Bull setup. And I mean, look, it's so big. I mean, as a mechanic, you could climb under there and start working on the car without even having to jack it up. It's ridiculous. But the reason they do it is, I've talked about this in many videos before, but the main reason they're able to get away with this, the reason they try and get away with this, is because all the measurements on a Formula One car are taken from what is known in the regulations as the reference plane. The reference plane is the underside of the bottom, the lowest point of the carbon fibre floor. Or more specifically, it's the top of the skid plank that bolts to that. So that, of course, runs along here. Now, things like front wing height are measured from that. You're allowed as a minimum front wing height, of course, but it's taken from that reference plane. So if you can jack your car up like this angle, the reference plane is now at that angle, isn't it? Running all the way down, which means although your front wing height is still above the minimum requirement over and above the reference plane is now pointing all the way down, which means you're able to get your front wing much lower to the ground. And by doing that, you start to employ ground effect by that, because it's squeezing the airflow past the wing through the gap between the wing and the racetrack. You start to get different effects, more powerful effects, more dramatic difference in pressure between the underside of the wing and the top of the wing, and that's where you get your downforce from. Squeezing the airflow through this little gap here, exactly the same at the front of the floor leading edge. You lower the pressure because the airflow speeds up as it travels through that tiny gap. This is called Bernoulli's principle for those who are interested in that. Bernoulli's principle says that the faster a fluid moves through a gap, the lower its pressure drops. And when the pressure drops low through gaps like this, the ambient pressure, which is much higher above it, pushes down, trying to get towards the lower pressure zone underneath. And that is where we get a lot of our downforce from. That is what is pushing the car into the racetrack, trying to generate grip. So by employing this really steep high rake angle, you start to maximize the effects of the front wing and the underfloor. And of course, by expanding, having the gap being its lowest at the front of the floor underneath the car, and then expanding gradually, you start to exaggerate, if you like, the effect of that diffuser, whereby the pressure is expanding all the way up as the gap is expanding, and therefore it's pulling more and more high-speed airflow through that critical gap at the front. And again, you get more and more effect from the underfloor aerodynamics. You get more and more downforce produced. That's why they do it. Now, you might say, well, why doesn't everyone do it? And lots of people are now. It's been moving that way. Red Bull were the first. Red Bull have definitely been the most effective. Yes, it seems like an obvious win, but there are a number of downsides or tricky challenges to overcome. Notably, the fact that this gap is always changing, and therefore this gap is always changing as the aerodynamic load pushes on the car, as the suspension compresses over bumps around the racetrack, as the car rolls and pitches through acceleration and braking. These gaps are always changing. And if these gaps are always changing, so is the aerodynamic effect that you're getting through that, which means you don't have it's much more difficult to get a stable aero platform, which is really what you want as an aerodynamicist and as a driver as well. So, also we've got these big gaps here, which become very difficult to seal because they're literally so big. And if you can't seal them, you get the high pressure airflow spilling in underneath, squirting in from the tyre, disrupting this low pressure zone underneath the car. So there are a number of challenges which make this a really tricky thing to get right. But if you do get it right, the potential benefits are far greater than you would otherwise have if you didn't have that high rake angle. That's the theory behind what Red Bull have been able to do so effectively over the last few years. Okay, well, there it is. As I say, loads of things that will be recognisable as typically Red Bull, typically Adrian Newey as well. The front wing, for example, if we zoom in on that, you can start to see immediately that their theory of maximising the entire allowable area of the front wing has been done again. That has been done to maximise the amount of downforce that's able to be produced from that space there, using these flaps to expand all the way across from the highest point here right out to the top of the end plate. Now on the Ferrari, for example, it rises up here, but then it tapers all the way down to the very bottom of the inside of the end plate to create this channel to encourage the outwash effect out past the wheel. Well, the point of doing that is very clear. It's about dragging the turbulent tyre wake away from the car, but the negative side of that is you're limited on the amount of downforce that particularly the front end is able to produce. So Red Bull have opted to go for a much more high downforce producing setup, very similar to that of the Mercedes in that sense as well. Something that is new though is this area here around the front of the nose. Now that little nostril at the front, now that's not necessarily new. We've seen Red Bull employ that in the past, and that's about just removing the obstruction at the front of that nose tip. It's just a clear slot, a hole to allow the flow to pass through there and then underneath the nose. If you don't have that, you get a very different effect where the airflow spills over the edge of that nostril, of that nose, thumb tip rather, and then it becomes turbulent and you have to deal with it further down the line. So by removing the restriction, you just allow a more clear path for that flow to get to that crucial area underneath. This bit here though, this is new. That's not something we've seen before. It looks a bit like a coin holder that you might have had in your car back in the 80s. But I think the idea behind this, and without seeing further details, we are kind of guessing at this point, but my best guess would be that that is to help feed the S duct that we'll show you in a moment further downstream. Just again, picking up the flow that's coming off the top of here, collecting it, allowing it a very clear channel through some ducting, I would imagine, inside the nose and out of the S duct. And what happens is, the reason behind these S ducts is that the flow coming off the front of the wingtip, the nostril, the front of the nose, the wing pillar mounts, it all starts to spill over the edges here. It starts to roll over the side and becomes very turbulent. It becomes very slow moving because it's turbulent. And what you really want, particularly in the front of the floor, as I just mentioned, even more important when you're employing that high rake example like Red Bull do, is to get a really fast flowing, clear stream of air into that channel. That's what maximizes the impact. So if you've got turbulent, slow moving flow, that's not what you want. So the S duct is really about trying to collect up that turbulent flow and get rid of it from that really important area. Now lots of teams do this in slightly different ways. Some have ducts in the side of the nose, some have ducts underneath the nose itself, others do it in different means. I suspect that's what Red Bull are trying to do here, but the way that it works, let me just zoom in on that. The way that it typically works is that the flow ends up inside the nose in a duct from whichever means the team deems the best, and then it passes inside through an S-shaped duct and out to the top, and then it's ejected up here out of the S duct exit at the top of the chassis. And the reason it's ejected up there is because it's just less harmful up there than it would be if it was left unchecked, if you like, down underneath the floor. So that's a kind of less critical area for that messy, turbulent, slow-moving flow to be ejected rather than leave it to pass underneath the car. That's why they do it. Now look, one thing that is very new on the Red Bull is this cape. It's not new to the pit lane. We've seen it before in Formula One because Mercedes have used this on a number of occasions now very effectively. And essentially what it is almost like a splitter. It's like a separator between the flow that needs to be channeled underneath the car and the flow that passes over the top through the suspension and on towards the barge boards and that kind of area. Now, it's a very effective way, as I say, of collecting up and shoveling almost as much fast-moving airflow as you can into that crucial underfloor area. And that's why Mercedes have used it, and it's just interesting to see that Red Bull have seen that. They've obviously tried it in wind tunnels and tested it in their own CFD simulations and found it to be effective, and now we see it on the actual car. If we move up the nose, you can start to see these nice little profiled ears. Again, not necessarily new to Red Bull, we've seen them in the past. That there is the S duct exit. Somebody asked me this the other day. That there is what we call the pitot tube. If you don't know, that is basically a sensor measuring wind speed or airspeed that the team use. Just behind it, that little bulge on the top of the chassis there, that is the 360-degree camera. Now, if you ever see on the broadcast the camera panning around as the car makes an overtake, that's where it comes from. Now, the other reason I wanted to zoom in at this area and show you, I think this is quite interesting, is these little elements here, and you can see the profiling of the suspension members, like the top rear wishbone leg there. You can see how it's angled down, profiled very deliberately, directing the airflow down, particularly down towards this barge board area just behind it. And that's very deliberate. You can see the barge board area, really quite complicated. It will change constantly, but what I wanted to show you is just how these elements here and this big horizontal piece are very clearly picking up the flow that's been directed off this rear wishbone, top wishbone rearward leg here. You can see how the path is very deliberate onto there. And even up from this piece here, this little ear, you can see they're all working in conjunction with each other to get the best effect. And from this overhead shot, this front end shot, you can really see even more clearly what I'm talking about, how this little profiled element here links into the suspension members and then into the barge boards, and then it's passing it on to the vertical elements on the floor. And you can just see how very scientifically, very deliberately, the flow is being passed all the way on from one to the next and all the way along the car and into that really crucial area right at the back, the Coke bottle right above the diffuser. But the whole process starts all the way down here, right at the very front. Each one of these elements just creating a little vortex by spinning up the airflow off each element, passing it on to the next piece, which then adds some energy or some power to that vortex very deliberately. These pieces are positioned millimetre perfect to be able to do that. Each one adding some energy and some power to that vortex, allowing it to remain under the aerodynamicist's control, if you like, all the way from this part, metres and metres back towards the rear of the car where it needs to be worked at its most effective. And that's I think a really nice way to see just exactly what's happening, what the channel of flow is and how these aerodynamicists are thinking when they start looking at these cars. It's very easy to look at it and say, look at this massive sort of explosion of pieces that look like they've been shot with a aerodynamic shotgun to the side of the car and they just landed anywhere. It's not like that. It's very, very meticulously and carefully worked out. Now, the other thing you can see from this angle is how Red Bull have slimmed in the nose. Now, that wasn't like that last year. They had a much wider nose section, and there's a very obvious aerodynamic benefit in it being slimmer, of course, but as I've mentioned in other videos, there's a massive structural challenge in doing that, because you still have to pass the same crash tests by the FIA, the same load tests that you had to do when your nose cone was of a much wider cross section, and that's no easy task. The other thing you can see is that this cape that I was talking about here, how it forms this almost like a tunnel underneath the nose cone, shoveling and directing that fast channel of airflow in towards the front of the floor. So that's very clear from that as well. You can also see on this how Red Bull have lowered their suspension. I talked in the McLaren video where they had a very raised suspension setup to allow a much clearer path underneath it all to send the big spinning vortex coming off the front wingtips through that clear path and on towards this area here. Well, what Red Bull have decided to do is to take the centre of gravity benefit that comes from lowering the whole suspension setup, because it's not just these elements, of course, it's all the gubbins that goes along with it inside, lowering the centre of gravity, taking that benefit. And what you do then is you do create this slightly messy area that you have to guide these elements through, and that's really where this cape really comes into effect. It starts to help that process to navigate the flow past the suspension components that you have to get past. So that's an interesting, very obvious difference between this and something like the McLaren or the Mercedes, where they have the whole lot raised up. In fact, so much so that on the McLaren, the steering track rod, the steering arm coming off the steering rack inside the chassis, is actually aligned with the lower wishbone, whereas here it's aligned with the upper wishbone. Just shows you how much difference there is. And now looking at the roll hoop, we can see on here that unlike the Ferrari, they've gone with a big wide oval section there. Now what happens here is you've got an allowable area in the regulations to put bodywork in that section. Ferrari have narrowed theirs into a small triangular piece, which gives them extra space to put those little winged horns on the side of the roll hoop, which allow some control of the flow pushing over the back of the bodywork and on towards the rear wing. Well, because Red Bull have taken all of their space up with this, they've had to go for a big horizontal winglet underneath. Similar idea behind it. It's all about adding control and sending that flow nicely over the rear bodywork and on towards the rear wing. They've just had to do it in a slightly different manner. And you can actually see, if you zoom in here, they've also got some little tiny vertical shaped winglets or fins on the back of the chassis just behind the halo here. And you can just see how they're curved and shaped, very deliberately angling and directing the flow to exactly where they need it to get to. And all of this is about cleaning up the horribly messy zone around the cockpit opening, the driver's crash helmet and that halo that is so crucial when it gets beyond that. But this is a very difficult area to manage as an aerodynamicist. So these little details are all about doing that. Now, the other thing this picture shows here is the rear suspension. Now at the rear, they have raised the suspension up a long way, a little bit like Mercedes have at the front end by attaching the top wishbone on a big stalk into the upright. So instead of the wishbone going directly into the upright itself, they've raised it up, put it on this big angled bracket here to allow a clearer path for the flow coming around the floor and into the coke bottle area to exit through and above the back of the diffuser. It's such an important area for maximising the diffuser effect and that underfloor effect, again, particularly on the high rake car. So it's not just about jacking the rear of the car up to achieve this high rake impact. Everything else has to be focused around that and centered around that and factored into the overall design if you want to go that way. And that is absolutely part of that process. Now the side pods are, I guess, what we would now say is reasonably typical at the leading edge area, where we've got this horizontal winglet, that's the FIA crash structure being used for aerodynamic benefit and attaching to this vertical fin coming off the floor, horizontal wing coming off the side of the chassis. These two elements are designed, one to control flow around this part of the floor and exit side of the engine cover, and this one to control the flow over the top of the engine cover, just to make sure it remains attached to this surface as it follows the contours and down into that really important area back there. So typical of many teams now, the wing mirrors got these aerodynamic little features over the top. That's relatively standard these days. The top body itself really nicely slimmed in at the back end, quite bulbous leading edge, but very, almost no undercut around this side, but really slimmed in at the back end. That's something that Adrian Newey is all about, isn't it? It's about aerodynamic first, everything else second. And that's one of the advantages that they have in working with Honda the way they do as an almost de facto manufacturer team, is that they can work together on the design of the power unit and the aerodynamics. Adrian Newey can go to Honda and say, look, this is what I need to achieve at the rear end. Can you package the power unit around it? And Honda will come to Adrian Newey and say, look, these are the absolute bare minimums we need in terms of cooling and the size requirements we need for packaging. Can you shape your aerodynamics around it? And together, they'll build what they see as the optimum car around all that. That's what you get from being a manufacturer-based team. And it's what Red Bull hope that this relationship will start to really bear fruit from, is this idea that they're working so closely together. At the rear end, and this is perhaps an example of this, the exhaust, the tailpipes, the wastegate pipes, twin wastegate pipes to either side of the main tailpipe. Now that allows you to lower the engine cover. So that might have been something, for example, that Adrian went to Honda and said, look, this is what I need to achieve. And they've come up with this kind of packaging solution. It could be that. Now the penalty, of course, is you have a slightly wider top body, but maybe that's what they've deemed to be optimum, as opposed to having these two stacked on top of each other, where you get a slimmer but taller effect. And this here, look, see that looks like it's gold at the back end there? Well, that's because it is gold. That is genuine gold foil tape. It's incredibly expensive stuff, but it's real gold because it has the most incredible heat reflective properties. And if you didn't have it on areas like this, really close to the exhaust, these wing mounts made of carbon fibre would just melt and fail very quickly. So I thought that was quite an interesting detail that we can see up close. And finally, I just want to leave you with one other interesting detail that we can see really closely. Nice work around the floor, as I say, shows just how narrow that gap is, how much space we've got for driving flow through and out to the back of the diffuser. But the thing I want to leave you with here is that something that you may already know, but we don't get to see this clearly that often because I've got such a high-res image, is this, the rear wheel, the rim of the car, and it's just these raised elements all the way around the inside. Now, most people know they're there, and most people know they're there for managing temperatures, but we can see them so clearly, and it's just about raising the surface area, increasing the surface area by putting these raised lumps all the way around the rim. If you can raise the surface area, have more surface area to dissipate heat from things like brakes, and of course, that is all about trying to manage that all-important rear tyre temperature. So look, an interesting car. I think it's picked up where it left off last year, but why wouldn't it? Red Bull are on the up, and if Honda can take a little step forward as well, why can't these guys really take the challenge to Mercedes in this final year of this kind of regulation? Could we see a 2 or a 3-way fight at the front? It's what we all hope for. It's what we've all hoped for so long now. Maybe this car could be the one to take it to them. Let's hope so. Anyway, if you've liked the video, give it a thumbs up. Thank you very much. If you're not subscribed to the channel yet, please do subscribe. Hit the little symbol down here somewhere. All it'll do is you click that and you're done. That's it, you're subscribed. You won't miss another one because there's a video like this for every one of the new cars, but even more so than that, we do this all year round. This is what we do. We talk about cars, fast cars, racing cars, and all the technology that's involved in those. So if that's your cup of tea, hit subscribe and hopefully you'll enjoy coming along for the ride. Right, I'll see you very shortly. We'll try and get back on track with the Mercedes video and the AlphaTauri video and anything else that pops up in the next couple of days. Thanks very much, folks. See you soon.